So last week we looked at several issues. First, what is Christianity? And second of all, how do we know that Christianity is true? At the end of our Saturday lectures, we looked at the various ways people approach this question of how do you know that Christianity is true? And I landed on the side of the majority of the tradition that said that we know that Christianity is true because of the internal witness of the Spirit, along with the self-attesting gospel. On Sunday, we began to switch gears a little bit and we asked the question whether God exists. And as I indicated in the Saturday lectures, we can know that Christianity is true through the internal witness of the Holy Spirit plus the self-attesting gospel, or better still, the internal witness of the Spirit working on the self-attesting gospel in our hearts. That's the primary way that we can come to know that Christianity is true, but there is a secondary warrant that can come about through the evidence for God's existence and the evidence for Christianity. It's also the way in which we show non-believers that Christianity is true. So it has multi-functions. It's a way of adding extra warrant to our faith, but it's also a way of showing the unbeliever that Christianity is true, so that when you're out talking about the faith, you don't talk about the internal witness so much as you ask them to consider the evidence. And so we looked at several lines of evidence last Sunday for God's existence. We looked at the Kalam Cosmological Argument. We looked at the fine-tuning of the universe, and we looked at the moral argument for God's existence. So if you missed that lecture should be going up on YouTube today, so you can watch that if you missed it. But that brings up the question, what do we do now? How do we take the next step into Christianity? The classical apologetic for Christianity is really a two-step approach. The first step is, here are most of us. We're born in this world without God and without hope in the world. We are not theistic, naturally speaking, but paradoxically, we are theistic, naturally speaking. So it's just a weird paradox that we humans are. But someone comes along and offers the Kalam cosmological argument or the teleological argument or the moral argument or some other kind of argument for God's existence. And we consider it and we hear it. We look at the evidence for God's existence and we mentally assent to it. And we move into the theistic worldview, and we've adopted a kind of Abrahamic theistic philosophy. And so here we are as Abrahamic theists, but that, of course, in itself doesn't mean that our options are just one. There's not one theistic religion out there. There's Judaism, there's Christianity, there's Islam. So how do you decide between these three monotheisms once you become a monotheist? Historically, the three monotheistic religions have offered miracles as their test. Once you embrace Abrahamic theism, you have embraced natural revelation. You believe that the world around you reveals a God. So we have natural revelation. God reveals himself through nature. The religious expressions of Abrahamic theism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, ask you to also embrace special revelation. What is God's special revelation? It is God's self-disclosure through a writing or a prophet or a speaker of some kind telling you things about God that you would not otherwise know through your reason. We don't really need to know the Bible to know that God exists, but there are things about God in the Bible that we can't know through reason. So how do you discern the revelation claim of a religion? And in particular, if a prophet comes along and says to you something that is something your reason can't comprehend or at least understand on its own, how do you tell the difference between that and just a really stupid opinion? Because at face value, the revelation that you're getting is going to be, at least initially, apparently contradictory. Because if it's above reason, it will tend to look like it goes against reason. Well, the answer is miracle. If this prophet is accompanied by a bona fide miracle, then you can know that God is speaking through this individual. We live in a world where all kinds of people are running around saying, I speak for God, and they claim to do miracles. Just because God can do anything doesn't mean that he's done everything people have said about him. So the question is, how do you know which of these religions has provided us with bona fide miracles? And what's really interesting here is that Judaism could say, well, 1 million people watched the deliverance of the law on Mount Sinai, and the Red Sea and the plagues and all of that happened during the Exodus generation. So we have bona fide miracles vindicating our revelation claim. But even if the Orthodox Jew was able to give a full historical vindication of those miracle claims, has Judaism over and against Christianity been established? Well, the answer is no, because Christians also believe that those miracles happened. What about Islam? Does Islam offer a miracle that we should consider? The answer is yes and no. It turns out that Muhammad never really performed any miracles, but the Muslim apologist is going to tell you that the Quran is the grand miracle of Islam. Now, rather than vet our way through those religions, we're in a study of the life of Christ anyway. It's best, I think, to consider the claims of Christ first. According to Christianity, there are two miracles that God performed through the life of Jesus, which totally vindicate his claims. The first miracle is something you cannot see, and that is to say that God incarnated himself in the person of Jesus. Well, I can't really verify that miracle. However, if Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, and if Jesus actually rose from the dead, which is something that is in principle verifiable, then that would indicate that Christianity is true. And so the first step in trying to discern which of these three Abrahamic religions is true, I think, would be to look at the life of Christ. But that, of course, raises another question. When you open up the New Testament, it just makes these claims. Why think that those claims are true? Well, one of the things that you can do whenever you face a problem is you could say, what do the experts say? We can at least have a conversation about where most experts stand on a particular issue. If I want to fix my car engine, I go to an expert, right? Well, if I want to know what I can and I should and should not believe about Jesus, maybe I could go to New Testament scholars, at least at first, and ask, well, what are they saying about Jesus? And one of the things that you immediately are struck with when you begin to look at what the majority of New Testament scholars are saying about Jesus is that they're saying a lot. In fact, there are 10 facts about Jesus that the vast majority of New Testament critics will adhere to. And not only will they adhere to these 10 facts as New Testament critics, but these New Testament critics are in a lot of ways, or in many cases, atheists, process theologians, pantheists. In other words, these guys come from all different kinds of worldviews, and they nevertheless say that the New Testament teaches these things about Jesus, and in fact, these are based on fact. Not only are these individuals saying these things about Jesus, but these are individuals who think that the New Testament is not historically trustworthy, which I find quite amazing. In other words, when you open up the New Testament, they're going to say the New Testament has the burden of proof to show that this is a fact. We don't just take it for granted. Again, I find this amazing. Now, I'm not the only one to make this observation. Gary Habermas written on this a lot. William Lane Craig has written on this a lot. Michael Licona has written on this a lot. There are a number of scholars out there who are looking at what the critics are saying and saying, wow, we don't agree with you on your final conclusions, but this is a very good start. The way Michael Licona would put it is this: what if we were to get the most critical scholars in the world and bring them in here and they were going to hammer out a statement as to what they think Jesus said and did? It would be fair to say that the 10 facts that you're seeing on the screen are in fact facts. Now, here's my thesis for this morning. There are 10 facts about Jesus that are granted by all or nearly all scholars, even the most skeptical. That's my second statement, is that these facts provide adequate inductive grounds for inferring the resurrection of Jesus. That second proposition is something that your typical critic is not going to accept. Most of these individuals that I'm going to quote for you do not think that God exists. And if they do think that God exists, they don't think that God intervenes in our world. They definitely do not think that Jesus rose from the dead. So guess where they stand on the virgin birth? Well, there's less evidence for the virgin birth than the resurrection, so they're definitely not going to accept the virgin birth. Okay, so what are the 10 facts that the average critic will accept about Jesus? Well, fact number 1, the man, Jesus of Nazareth, was a real historical person. 2, the historical Jesus had disciples. 3, the historical Jesus was a good and profound moral teacher. 4, the historical Jesus claimed to be specially chosen, even anointed by God for a special mission. 5, the historical Jesus performed extraordinary deeds. 6, The historical Jesus died by means of crucifixion. 7. The corpse of the historical Jesus was properly buried in a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. 8. The tomb in which Jesus' corpse was buried was later found empty by a group of his women followers. 9. The earliest followers of the historical Jesus experienced him alive again as a living reality. And 10. The earliest followers of the historical Jesus sincerely came to believe that Jesus had experienced the resurrection from the dead. Now, all of you should be quite surprised by this fact, that even skeptical scholars, even people that don't think that Christianity is even true, are willing to grant these 10 facts. So let's look at some examples. I've picked about 5 or so scholars to vet for each of the facts. So it's going to be, for the most part, 2 scholars per fact that I'm going to quote. This is a really good start to sort of give us a skeleton of what people are saying about the historical Jesus. So what does Bart Ehrman say? Bart Ehrman is an atheist. We were talking about him just before I started lecturing this morning. He wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And the book was written for a popular audience. In fact, he got in a protracted debate with a Christ mythicist. A Christ mythicist is someone who thinks that Jesus did not exist. I only know of 2 scholars that are defending Christ mythicism today. So if you go to the Society of Biblical Literature, there'll be about 4,000 biblical scholars there. The New Testament scholars will probably make up about half of that, give or take. Well, 2,000 scholars in the Society of Biblical Literature, right? There are only 2 scholars that are putting in print that they don't think that Jesus existed. So most of the websites that you go to where somebody will be saying there was no historical Jesus, there was no person named Jesus, that is a popularizer. He may have done a lot of research, but he's not a scholar in the sense that he has a PhD or master's degree in his field, or he has not contributed to peer-reviewed literature in any way. He's just writing blogs, which is fine, free speech, right? But just know that when you go to those blogs, you're not reading the work of a noted scholar. In fact, if you look at the YouTube channel Myth Vision, which is a channel dedicated to destroying Christianity, Derek Lambert started off as a Christ mythicist, but now he has moved beyond using Robert Price as his #1 scholar that he features there, and now he features Bart Ehrman a lot. And he has switched from just a pure Christ mythicism, Jesus didn't exist, to sort of Bart Ehrman's position. There was a man named Jesus. He definitely was not the Son of God, because Bart Ehrman's an atheist. There was no God, right? Or there is no God. So he's not going to obviously say all that we're going to say about Jesus. But he is now saying that Jesus did exist. Here's what Bart Ehrman says. Serious historians of the early Christian movement, all of them, have spent many years preparing to be experts in their field. It is striking that virtually everyone who has spent all the years needed to attain these significant qualifications, or these qualifications rather, is convinced that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. Or Michael Grant. To sum up, modern critical methods failed to support the Christ myth theory. It has again and again been answered and annihilated by first-ranked scholars. In recent years, no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus, or at any rate, very few, and they have not succeeded in disposing the much stronger, indeed very abundant evidence to the contrary. And I could reproduce quotes like this over and over again. Fact number 2, Jesus had disciples. E.P. Sanders, in his book, The Historical Figure of Jesus, said in reality, Jesus had a group of followers at any one time numbering more or less 12. In a blog article, Joshua Dairley, who is writing for Bart Ehrman, said he gave a list of 15 facts about Jesus that we could all agree on. By the way, one of his 15 facts is Jesus was born in Nazareth. So I guess we can't agree on all of them. But the 15 facts that Joshua Dairley, I'm totally butchering his name, his 15 facts are not going to match all of my facts. But he has about 10 on there that I agree with, and that probably most conservative Christians would agree with. So here's what he says on the blog article. He says, Paul also mentions the 12, although some scholars have wondered whether this was merely a name for the group rather than an actual number. Either way, it's almost certain that Jesus did have disciples during his lifetime. Fact number 3, Jesus was a profound moral teacher. Now, for this one, I went to philosophers because ethics is really a philosophical issue. And so I went to philosophers and I asked the question, what do most philosophers think when they read through the Gospels and read the teachings of Jesus? And one of the philosophers I decided to quote for you was Thomas Paine. And to set up the quote that I want to give you, I gave you another quotation. Thomas Paine, are y'all familiar with Thomas Paine? He wrote The Age of Reason. He also wrote Common Sense, which was the book that inspired most Americans to enter into the revolution. It was probably the number one reason why many Americans flipped from being Tory to patriot in the year 1776. A few years later, he writes The Age of Reason, which was his diatribe against Christianity. And this is what he says about Christianity. Of all the systems of religion that were ever invented, there's none more derogatory to the Almighty. He's a deist, all right? More unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, and more contradictory in itself than this thing called Christianity. Too absurd for belief, too impossible to convince, and too inconsistent for practice that renders the heart torpid or produces only atheists and fanatics. As an engine of power, it serves the purpose of despotism and as a means of wealth, but so far as respects the good of man in general, it leads to nothing here or hereafter. So this is a man that does not like Christianity, right? But notice what he says. He says, nothing that is here said can apply, even with the most distant disrespect, to the real character of Jesus Christ. He was a virtuous and amiable man. The morality that he preached and practiced was of the most benevolent kind, and though similar systems of morality had been preached by Confucius, by some of the Greek philosophers many years before, by the Quakers since, and by many good men in all ages, it has not been exceeded by any. Albert Einstein says this. He says, if one purges the Judaism of the prophets and Christianity as Jesus Christ taught it of all subsequent additions, especially those of the priests, one is left with a teaching which is capable of curing all the social ills of humanity. It is the duty of every man of good will to strive steadfastly in his own little world to make this teaching of pure humanity a living force so far as he can. If he makes an honest attempt in this direction without being crushed and trampled underfoot by his contemporaries, he may consider himself and the community to which he belongs lucky. So, fact number 4, Jesus claimed to be a man chosen, even anointed by God for a special mission. Up to this point in my life, as I've been teaching through this material, I have said things like, well, Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, or Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. I realized I was not really giving accurate information. The vast majority of scholars do not believe that the historical Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, nor do they believe that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah in the ancient Jewish sense of the term. I'm going to give you a quotation here by Bart Ehrman, and I'm going to have to give you some commentary on it, but because it may seem to contradict what I just said. But we can at least say this: Jesus did see himself as someone specially anointed by God for a mission. So even though he may not have claimed to be the Messiah, he at least claimed to be a Messiah who was sent by God on a special mission. And here's what Ehrman says. Jesus must have thought that he would be the king of the kingdom of God, soon to be brought by the Son of Man, and what is the typical designation for the future king of Israel, Messiah. It is in this sense that Jesus must have taught his disciples that he was the Messiah. Now, that seems to contradict what I just said, right? You have to remember that Bart Ehrman does not believe that Jesus is the Son of Man. He does not believe that Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. When Jesus spoke of a Son of Man, he was talking about someone else. The Son of Man would finally come and deliver the kingdom and allow Jesus to be the one who rules over the kingdom on this earth. So Jesus saw himself sort of in third place in the hierarchy, I guess, of human prophets or people that would deliver the message of God. Now, we disagree with him, obviously. It is significant that Ehrman is still going to say that Jesus saw himself as specially chosen by God for a purpose. And I'm just trying to lay that down for you right now as evidence, or at least as something that most scholars believe. E.P. Sanders says this: Jesus regarded himself as having full authority to speak and act on behalf of God. Sanders will say in his book that Jesus never took on the label, the Messiah, but he nevertheless regarded himself as having full authority to speak and act on behalf of God. Sinners who followed him, but who may or may not have returned to the Mosaic law, would have a place in God's kingdom. From the point of view of those who were not persuaded, he was arrogant and attributed to himself a degree of authority that was most inappropriate. From the point of view of his followers and sympathizers, He offered an immediate and direct route to God's love and mercy, establishing a relationship that would culminate when the kingdom fully came. Jesus was a charismatic, an autonomous prophet. That is, his authority, in his own view and that of his followers, was not mediated by any human organization, not even by Scripture. He said, in effect, give up everything you have and follow me because I am God's agent. So Jesus saw himself as extremely important in the plan of God, whatever that is. That's what most scholars are saying today. Now, here's one of my favorites that the average critics are admitting. Are y'all aware of the Jesus Seminar? Raise your hand if you've never heard of the Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar was a group of radically skeptical scholars that met in the 80s, and they voted on what Jesus said and did. They assumed at the outset that the New Testament cannot be trusted. So when you're reading the New Testament has to prove itself that it's actually accurate, or else I'm just going to reject it as false. So we have to mediate the New Testament through our grid of historical criticism, and only then can I accept it as true or possibly true or whatever. And they actually color-coded Jesus' sayings. If you have a statement of Jesus and it's colored in red, that means that the Jesus Seminar thinks that Jesus actually said that thing. If it's pink, he may not have said those actual words, but he said something very close to it. Gray, it probably was taught by the early church, but Jesus probably didn't say it. And then black, there's no way Jesus or even the earliest Christians said something like this. So if you get to the Gospel of John, every single quotation of Jesus is in black, okay? Over 80% of the quotations of Jesus in the New Testament are not uttered by Jesus, according to the Jesus Seminar. And the same thing with his actions. There's very little, therefore, that we can know about the historical Jesus reading the New Testament. And yet it turns out that the majority of scholars, even those in the Jesus Seminar, thinks that Jesus performed extraordinary deeds. Now, when I say that Jesus performed extraordinary deeds, I'm being very particular here. I'm not saying that the majority of scholars think that Jesus performed miracles. Obviously, if you think he performed miracles, then you would automatically be saying that God is acting through him. These are atheists. And so they're obviously not going to say that God is working through a person, because that would just totally destroy their own worldview, right? They are saying, however, that Jesus did things that were extraordinary. He actually engaged in healing people. This first scholar that I'm quoting is J.P. Meyer. He was a Catholic scholar who wrote one of the definitive lives of Jesus in the 20th century, 21st century, a 5-volume work on the life of Christ. And here's what he says. He says, the historical fact that Jesus performed extraordinary deeds, deemed by himself and others to be miracles, is very carefully worded, is supported by most impressively by the criterion of multiple attestation of sources and forms and the criterion of coherence. The miracle traditions about Jesus' public ministry are already so widely attested in various sources and literary forms by the end of the first Christian generation that total fabrication by the early church is, practically speaking, impossible. And this is why Marcus Borg, who is a process theologian, doesn't think that Jesus ever claimed to be the Son of God or anything like that, doesn't think that Jesus rose from the dead, doesn't think that Jesus actually performed bona fide miracles, nevertheless says the following. He says, behind this picture of Jesus as healer and exorcist, I affirm a historical core. In common with the majority of contemporary Jesus scholars, I see the claim that Jesus performed paranormal healings and exorcisms as history remembered. Indeed, more healing stories are told about Jesus than about any other figure in the Jewish tradition. He must have been a remarkable healer. That's quite a statement. My favorite quotation from the work of the Jesus Seminar is as follows. This is awesome. The fellows, by a narrow majority, concluded that Jesus cured at least one blind person. So you have these skeptics who think that the New Testament cannot even be trusted as an historical source, nevertheless being persuaded through the historical evidence, well, he had to have healed at least one blind person. That's pretty amazing stuff if you think about it. Now, you might say, well, what do they think? How do you think Jesus did that? Well, they would appeal to some sort of natural cause, psychosomatic healings or something like that. Fine, we can talk about the explanation for how he did what he did later. This is a fact of history that the majority of scholars are granting. In fact, Bart Ehrman wrote a book a few years ago where he talks about the gospel, and he laments this fact. So this would be a fact that Bart Ehrman doesn't agree to. Bart Ehrman says, I don't really know why my colleagues are granting this. Well, here's why your colleagues are granting this. It's too deeply embedded in the historical sources. If you're looking at this through the grid of an atheistic worldview, you're going to say, well, that's something else. And you're going to dismiss most of them. You're going to dismiss most of these stories. In fact, that Jesus performed a healing is a fact, according to these scholars. But any particular miracle story you have in the New Testament, they're probably going to dismiss as a mythic legend. The specific story is a mythic legend that grew out of the fact that Jesus was known for doing these kinds of things. That's how they would read these stories. I don't know if I'm scratching where you're itching, but yeah, I would agree that there's a meaning there that has to accompany the actual event. In fact, I don't think that Jesus ever did a miracle. I'm speaking to you as a believer. I don't think that Jesus ever did a miracle that didn't have a specific teaching function behind it. But that's obviously a different issue. What I'm trying to impress, and I know y'all get this, all of you, I'm trying to just impress the fact that skeptics are saying these things about Jesus. And I find it remarkable that this is a fact about Jesus that they're willing to grant. Now, crucifixion, I could double, triple, quadruple the scholars that are going to grant the crucifixion. This is the one thing about Jesus that everyone's going to grant in the first place. So I just picked Garrett Ludeman, who is an atheist and New Testament scholar. Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. And John Dominic Crossan, he comes from a Catholic background. He calls himself a Christian, but if you were to say, does God exist? He would say no. Do miracles happen? No. Did Jesus rise from the dead? No. But he says the crucifixion of Jesus is as sure as anything historical ever can be or can ever be. So I'm not going to dwell on that. That's the one fact that everybody agrees on, unless you're a Muslim, right? If you're a Muslim, then Jesus was not crucified. But it is remarkable that the only people in scholarship today who don't think Jesus was crucified are Christ mythicists who don't think Jesus existed. And I can only think of two right now on the top of my head, and Muslims, and that's it. I went to listen to a Muslim speaker when I was in college, and afterwards I cited some ancient historians who said that Jesus was crucified. And he said, I don't care what the historical evidence is. The Quran is the word of God. Therefore, it's false. That evidence doesn't wash. And I thought if my worldview depended on that kind of reasoning, a confirmation bias, I would be shaking in my shoes. Moving on. Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. In a book called The Empty Tomb, this book was edited by Robert Price and Jeffrey J. Lauder. The book is intended to refute the resurrection. That's the point of the book. But it's interesting that Jeffrey J. Lauder, an atheist, now he's not a New Testament scholar, but he's done a lot of writing on this, a very intelligent man. He says the burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea has a high final probability. You want a New Testament scholar? Rudolf Bultmann, the most famous New Testament scholar of the 20th century, famous for demythologizing the New Testament. We're getting rid of all those miracles, right? We're going to make sure that we have an historical core here about Jesus, and we're going to get rid of the miracles. Well, Bultmann, referring to the burial, he says, this is a historical account which makes no impression of being a legend apart from the women who appear again as witnesses. Now, what's really funny is the women as witnesses, as I'm going to explain later, that's actually one of the most historically significant parts of the story. But Bultmann says, well, that's the one thing that we can excise. But clearly, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. Again, doesn't think the New Testament is historically reliable, and yet he's granting the burial. Dale Allison, who calls himself a crypto-deist, saying that I don't really think that God intervenes, anything like that. I don't really believe in conventional, Christianity. He calls himself a Christian, but he's a Christian with the worldview of crypto-deism. He says, I find it likely that a man named Joseph, probably a Sanhedrist from the obscure Aram, sought and obtained permission from the Roman authorities to make arrangements for Jesus' hurried burial. I grant that the evidence is imperfect, and unlike John A.T. Robinson, who's John A.T. Robinson? He is an extremely liberal scholar, as liberal as the day is long. What does John A.T. Robinson say? He says, unlike John A.T. Robinson, I do not claim that the burial, quote, and here are the words of John A.T. Robinson, the burial must be accepted as one of the most firmly grounded facts of Jesus' life. So Dale Allison is a far more tempered scholar. He's not one for overstatement. If you read his stuff on the resurrection, he's got 2 books on the resurrection now, which I highly encourage you to read if you're going to be doing a deep dive on the resurrection. The 2 books that you really need to read if you want to read the counterpoint are Dale Allison's books. Nevertheless, he says, it remains possible that someone made up the story, yet there are no real signs of this, but rather several indications to the contrary. Further, nothing we know about Jewish burial practices or Roman law and custom or from archaeology contradicts Mark 15 at any point. And so Dale Allison will sign off on the burial. This, by the way, is one of the facts that Bart Ehrman will reject. He doesn't think that the burial tradition found in Mark 15 is historically accurate. Now, why would a scholar not want to think that the burial tradition is historically accurate? If you grant the burial tradition, you pretty much have to grant the empty tomb, which is our 8th fact. So the 2 kind of go hand in hand. There are 3 reasons why most scholars, in fact, Gary Habermas in his work has something like 20 arguments for the empty tomb. In my presentations, I've given about 10. But there are 3 easy arguments to remember. And among all the facts that I'm giving you, this is the one that's most disputed. The other facts that I'm giving you, we're talking about 90% or more of scholars who will say that this fact is a fact. The empty tomb is about 75% of scholars, 80% of scholars, something like that. So it's more disputed than the other facts. What are the reasons why most scholars believe that the empty tomb is a fact? You can actually spell out the word JET, J-E-T, as an acronym and give your reasons. And what is this acronym, JET, J-E-T? Jerusalem Factor, Enemy Attestation, and the Testimony of the Women. So Jerusalem Factor, where did the gospel first get preached? Well, it first got preached in the very city that Jesus was crucified. Jesus was buried in Jerusalem. And so the gospel began in the place where the burial of Jesus was known. So if you have the apostles walking around saying Jesus is resurrected, what's the first thing the enemies of the church are going to do? They're going to go exhume the body from the tomb and parade it around the streets and say, look, the guy didn't survive his death. He's dead. He's still dead, and that's it. Now, Robert Price has sneered at this. He has said, well, what do you think they're going to do? Just roll out the body? The body would have already decomposed to the point where he would be unrecognizable, and so it wouldn't have mattered. Not that it would have done anything anyway. When people want to believe something, they're going to believe something. I mean, Rastafarians still believe that Ali Selassie is the Messiah. The guy's been dead since 1976, right? When Shabbatai Zvi, are y'all familiar who Shabbatai Zvi is? Shabbatai Zvi was a messianic pretender of the 17th century. And this was amazing. Jews all over Europe believed the Messiah had come in this person of Shabbatai Zvi. Unfortunately, Shabbatai Zvi was captured by Muslims and they put a sword to his throat and they said, convert or die. And what did Shabbatai Zvi do? Allahu Akbar. He converted to Islam. Now, it's kind of bad when your Jewish Messiah converts to Islam. Did that keep people from believing in Shabbatai Zvi? No. There were Jews that said, well, that was his way of taking on our sin. They came up with all kinds of rationalizations as to why Shabbatai Zvi could still be the Jewish Messiah and convert to Islam. Now, why do I tell you this? Would producing the corpse in the city have kept the disciples from believing in Jesus as Messiah? Maybe not. Some people are just that crazy. They're going to believe anything, no matter what the evidence or lack thereof, right? We know this. But just as Sabbateanism in the 17th century stopped the halt of the movement when Shabbatai Zvi converted, it's not like a whole lot of Jews that were not already convinced said, oh yeah, I'm going to be persuaded now that he's the Messiah. And just as most people don't really take seriously the claims of Rastafari, they love the music of Bob Marley. I know I do. But they do not take seriously the claim that Ali Selassie is the Messiah. So also, if you had produced the corpse in the city, Peter and the other disciples may have been just crazy enough to keep believing. But don't you know that it would have stopped the movement cold? Nobody else would have believed. And so the Jerusalem factor is a powerful piece of evidence for the empty tomb. Second of all, enemy attestation. What did the enemies of Christianity say about the empty tomb? You're lying. There is no empty tomb? No. They said that the disciples came and stole away the body. See, they weren't denying the empty tomb. They were just denying the apostles' explanation for it. And that's why many people say, well, It had to have been empty, because it had it been filled, they would have come up with some other explanation. Then finally, and remarkably, and this is in lieu of Bultmann's point, the testimony of the women is significant. In the first century, the testimony of a woman was not considered valid in a court of law. So why, if you're making up the story of the empty tomb, do you have the chief witnesses to it women? Probably because that's just an uncomfortable fact that the early Christians had to deal with. The women discovered the tomb. And so that is what we call, and I'm going to explain this next hour, the criterion of embarrassment. You're not going to create a story that's going to cause embarrassment for your movement. So, Gezer Vermesh, non-Christian, says this: in the end, when every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the opinions of the Orthodox, the liberal sympathizer, and the critical agnostic alike, and even perhaps the disciples themselves, are simple interpretations of the one disconcerting fact, namely that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus found to their consternation not a body, but an empty tomb. Dale Allison, again, our crypto deist, he says this: looking back over the debate regarding the empty tomb, there is no irrefutable ironclad logic on either side. Neither case exorcises, not exercises, but exorcises, expunges all doubts. I am nonetheless not moved to declare a hopeless stalemate, for pro and con are not equal here. Rather, of our two opinions, that the tomb was in fact unoccupied, or that belief in the resurrection imagined it unoccupied, the former is, as I read the evidence, the stronger possibility, the latter the weaker. Okay, so that's the empty tomb. The post-mortem appearances, it may be taken, as Gerrit Ludemann says, this is amazing. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And then E.P. Sanders, that followers and later Paul had resurrection appearances is, in my judgment, a fact. Okay. And then finally, fact number 10, the sincere and life-changing faith of the disciples. Michael Golder is an atheist, and he says, belief in Jesus' resurrection does not rest on a fraud. Peter and Paul and the others had genuine conversions, which they experienced as visions. And the circumstances of the time, when there was widespread belief that the kingdom of God was coming and that the dead would be raised, these were quite naturally interpreted as evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. Gerrit Ludemann, we can no longer take the statements about the resurrection of Jesus literally. Why? People don't rise from the dead. However, it is certain that people at the time believed in the resurrection literally. So these are my 10 facts. I find this quite remarkable. So the question is, what do we do with those 10 facts? Now, as I said before, it doesn't really matter what worldview you hold to. Apparently, when you're studying the historical Jesus, something like the 10 facts that I've given are going to be the facts you're going to land on. There are extremes, Christ mythicists, or there are going to be some scholars that don't accept all of them, but the broad mainstream of scholars and even many skeptics, if you just limited yourself to skeptics, they're going to hold to these facts. Can you move from these facts are facts to therefore the resurrection happened? In other words, do these facts provide for us adequate inductive grounds for inferring the resurrection? I say the answer is yes, if you're an Abrahamic theist. If you're not an Abrahamic theist, then believing that Jesus rose from the dead is cray-cray. It didn't happen. Any explanation is more plausible than that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, let me give you one more fact that most scholars today are going to grant. So notice I have the first stage of the argument. The first stage of the inference is this: there are no plausible naturalistic hypotheses adequately explain the facts of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith. These last three facts that I shared with you, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith, or you could say the origin of the Christian way. These are the facts to be explained. How did the tomb get empty? What was behind those appearances of Jesus? Were they hallucinations? Right? Or how do you explain the fact that these disciples sincerely came to believe that Jesus had experienced the resurrection? These are the facts to be explained. And the vast majority of scholars are going to agree that there are no satisfactory answers to this. Most of these scholars are going to be agnostic. The disciples stole the body, the hallucination hypothesis, the copycat hypothesis, the idea that they ransacked pagan literature and said, oh, we have Osiris rising from the dead. we'll just say Jesus rose from the dead. All of those have been virtually universally rejected as good explanation. And so most scholars just don't take seriously the idea that the disciples broke in and stole the body. And you have to understand, these are scholars who don't think that there were guards at the tomb. That was a legendary overlay by Matthew. There was no guard at the tomb, but we know that the disciples didn't go in there and steal the body. How do we know that? Because a lot of these guys were willing to die for their faith. They were sincere. You don't die for a known lie. Liars make poor martyrs, as they say. Yeah. Now, most scholars are not going to grant that. Lazarus, yes. They were just mostly dead. Well, I think what the story does demonstrate is that no matter what your evidence, there are people that are just not going to believe. One of the things that I'm finding remarkable about this is that even these naturalistic explanations for these facts that are before us, scholars are not going to cling to these. And the few that do end up getting just dismissed. There's no way that the disciples experienced hallucinations. So these are not plausible facts. Now, in a course on apologetics where we're vetting this stuff in very great detail, I would vet these explanations and show you why. But I think most of you get why these are just not taken seriously. So again, where are most New Testament scholars when it comes to the explanation of these facts? They're agnostic. I don't know. I have no idea what happened. If you set forth your background knowledge as Abrahamic theism, we know that there's a God. And how do we know that there's a God? Well, we gave arguments for that last Sunday. And you also have as your background knowledge the 7 prior facts that Jesus was a healer, that Jesus was saying that he was God's special agent and speaking in the place of God, that Jesus was a good and profound moral teacher. You have those that's part of your background knowledge. And you look at these 3 facts, I would submit to you that the resurrection is the best explanation for those facts. So I'm in the minority when it comes to this. So no New Testament scholar is going to take seriously the argument for the resurrection. Why? Because they don't have the worldview that I have. And even those who have my worldview just have a very hard time saying that, yeah, you can give a good historical argument for this. This is the age in which we live in. We're just sort of walking in a kind of naturalistic fog, if you will, even those of us who are Christians. And I just want to submit to you that break that fog and take seriously the kinds of arguments that are coming out of scholarship that is produced by people like Lacona or Craig or Habermas. The resurrection hypothesis passes multiple criteria for historicity, thereby rendering it the best explanation of the known facts. And what are some of these criteria? Well, it's multiply attested. It also passes the criterion of embarrassment. Embarrassment, the resurrection is embarrassing to the early church? You bet. As Christianity began to go out into the Greek world, the Greeks didn't just laugh at Christians for believing in a crucified Messiah. They did, but that wasn't the only reason. Wait a minute. Your Messiah died on a cross, naked and humiliated? Are you kidding me? Wait, what? He rose from the dead? You mean his spirit rose, right? His spirit flew off into the eternal world. No. His body? Greeks thought the body was just corrupt and horrible. God would have nothing to do with the body. So it's really interesting that a lot of critics will say that the resurrection accounts in the Gospels actually come later than Paul. They will argue that Paul taught a spiritual resurrection and not a material or bodily resurrection. And then later, the Gospels, to appeal to their audiences, taught this literalistic resurrection of an empty tomb and all that stuff. And that is extremely counterintuitive when you understand the historical development or you understand intellectual history. The Greeks waiting for the gospel reception are going to be less likely to accept those stories. So you can't explain those stories by later accretions, putting a physical character to the resurrection. No, Paul taught a bodily resurrection, a physical resurrection. And the Gospels taught a bodily resurrection, a physical resurrection. And that's why I would say it passes the criterion of embarrassment. This is just something that would be embarrassing to later Greek culture as the gospel is making inroads. It has greater explanatory scope. It explains more facts. Let's say that you can make a very strong case that the disciples hallucinated visions of Jesus, and that explains the appearances. It wouldn't explain the empty tomb. In fact, it wouldn't even explain their belief in the resurrection. The Jews had multiple ways to explain what happened to a person after they died. Translation into heaven, that they believed that maybe this could be a vision of somebody coming up from the lower world. They had these venues to explain what would have happened to Jesus after his death. They could have just said, well, Jesus died, but he's going to come back. And when he does, you're going to be in trouble. They abandoned all of these venues that were available to them and embraced an unprecedented idea that a man rose from the dead in the middle of human history, something that the Jews were not anticipating at the time concerning the Messiah. Why would they abandon all of those explanations that were available to them in their tradition and embrace something like the resurrection from the dead? The hallucination hypothesis would not explain that. So in order to be a skeptic who gives an explanation for these facts, you have to embrace a kind of combinational hypothesis. The disciples stole the body, and then they hallucinated Jesus, and then went and read resurrection stories from pagan heroes. And you have to have that kind of combinational idea, none of which really explain the individual facts. But the resurrection is significant because it has this great explanatory scope. It explains all the facts without strain. In fact, it has explanatory power. It makes the facts more likely than they were before you considered the resurrection. So, for example, the sincere faith of the disciples is strengthened by the fact that the resurrection really happened. Now, first, it's in 15 where the 500 is mentioned. It's not mentioned in Acts. So the question was, how do those who promote the hallucination hypothesis account for the 500 witnesses? And the answer is they reject that as an historical fact. Now you might say, but I thought that they believed in the appearances. They do. They believe that Jesus appeared to Peter and the 12, so that all 12 apostles. So you have a group that is experiencing this appearance. And that is enough to refute the hallucination hypothesis, because we have no examples of a group hallucination ever. So I'm sad to report to you that most skeptics will reject the 500 witnesses, but you do realize that if they were to grant that, it would be game, set, match. They would have to pretty much, so they're going to have to deny that. But yeah, so your point is well taken. A group hallucination is an impossibility. Okay. Yeah. The outside of 1 Corinthians 15 is nowhere mentioned, the appearance of the 500. So that's why they dismiss it. Now, if God raised Jesus from the dead, and I just gave the case that he did, and I've not given the full case. I'm just giving you an outline of my apologetic. This is why I believe that the resurrection is a fact of history. If God raised Jesus from the dead, it does force us. Oh, by the way, these are some books you can read. The Sun Rises, Craig's dissertation on this, the argument of the resurrection. Assessing the New Testament evidence for the historicity of Jesus is not actually Craig's dissertation. He actually wrote a dissertation called The Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus during the deist controversy. And then the assessing book is sort of the leftovers of that. So it's 2 volumes, excellent work. Defending the Resurrection is kind of a mop-up operation where I actually contributed to this book, but we are responding to what critics are saying about this evidence for the resurrection. And I will say in passing that I actually developed a friendship from this. Hector Avalos attacked William Lane Craig's defense of the resurrection. In fact, Hector Avalos debated William Lane Craig, but he attacked Craig's defense of the resurrection in one of his books called The End of Biblical Studies. And so what I did in my essay is I just responded to his critique of Craig. And then Hector wrote 3 essays against me on a website called Debunking Christianity. So if you want to see 3 refutations of yours truly, you can go to Debunking Christianity. I believe it's a blog spot. We actually became friends as a result of this. I would exchange emails with him a lot. We actually met and had a 2-hour conversation on some of these issues. I was very sad when Hector passed away a few years ago. If you want a book to read on the resurrection of Jesus that you just need to start with, what is the book you start with? I think that you should start with either The Sun Rises by William Lane Craig, or a better book might be The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus that Gary Habermas and Mike Licona wrote. And what's great about the book is at the end, they have a DVD where you can test yourself on your resurrection knowledge. So you can actually take tests and kind of test yourself, quiz yourself on this, and you can just keep studying until you actually do a really good job on the test. So I think that's a great resource for anybody that wants to delve into the resurrection. To my credit students, I don't recommend that you read any of these books on the resurrection. We're going to be vetting the resurrection evidence a lot in our 3rd installment of this course on the life of Christ. But just to give you a heads up, these are some of the books you might want to read at that point. And then Michael Licona's dissertation, A New Historiographical Approach. It's a huge, thick volume that presents this material. And then Gary Habermas is in the middle of producing a 5-volume work on the resurrection. Each book, those two books that you're looking at, the first one is 1,500 pages, and the second one, I believe, is about 1,000 pages. And the other 3 volumes coming out, the next one's coming out in May, they are all going to be over 1,000 pages, where he is very meticulously going through the scholarly data. So I've not even really opened those books yet. I mean, I've kind of skimmed over the first 2 volumes because I have them, but I haven't had time to really look at them. But I'm really looking forward to sitting down and just working my way through this material. So those are some books. The Resurrection of God Incarnate by Richard Swinburne, a philosopher, but a very good little piece on the resurrection. I could not mention N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. This is a classic that really exploits, I'm sorry? Yes, it's 1,000 pages too. But N.T. Wright exploits that third piece of evidence that I gave, the last fact, the origin of the disciples' belief. He does a full analysis of all the ways in which you could explain how they came to believe the resurrection. And he shows that the copycat hypothesis is just not a legitimate hypothesis. And then finally, and to me most interestingly, this is a book that I've often recommended to unbelievers. And why do I recommend this to unbelievers? Because Pinchas Lapid never became a Christian. And yet he argues that the evidence is really, really good for the resurrection. In fact, he came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, you say, well, how do you not become a Christian? Well, he says, well, Jesus rose from the dead, but he wasn't God. Okay. And that he finds to be an amazing claim, and he just couldn't accept this claim. So he accepted the evidence for the resurrection. So you can't say that he's engaging in confirmation bias, that's for sure. But the resurrection evidence is really good, but I just couldn't bring myself to actually believe that Jesus is God. So in our last couple of minutes, I want to do 2 things. First, I think we need to revisit our facts and change one of them. If Jesus rose from the dead, obviously God was involved in his life. God raised Jesus from the dead. And that would force you to go back and reinterpret at least one of these facts. That would be fact number 5. Instead of Jesus performing extraordinary deeds, you would have to say, wait a minute, now that I know that Jesus experienced the resurrection, I need to interpret these extraordinary deeds as bona fide miracles, right? That God was working in the life of Jesus before he died, just as God worked in the life of Jesus after he died. Namely, he raised him from the dead. And that really sets up the next leg of our apologetic. Jesus has risen from the dead, but we still have not vindicated our contention that Jesus is the unique Son of God. And so if you'll bear with me for our last couple of moments, I do think it's appropriate for us to bring out the Lord, Liar, Lunatic argument. And this is what C.S. Lewis said. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of man who thinks he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God, but let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, as some of you probably surmise, Lord, Liar, Lunatic are not our only options. And so we have to improve upon Lewis's argument and offer some other logical possibilities to work through the argument. One possibility is that Jesus is a legend. Another possibility is that he's a liar or a lunatic, or maybe he's a llama or he's Lord. So the flow chart is, I think, really logical and straightforward. Did the historical Jesus claim to be Israel's Messiah and unique Son of God? Either the answer is no or yes. If no, then these are legends. These sayings of Jesus we find in the New Testament are legend. If yes, then that claim is either false or true. If false, then Jesus knew it was false, in which case he's a liar, or he did not know it was false, in which case he's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Or it's true, in which case he is a llama. What does that mean? Well, by Lama, I mean he's a guru, like an Eastern mystic who thinks we're all God. I'm just telling all of us that we're all God. I'm just trying to tap into the divinity within. Or he's Lord. So how would I work through this? Jacob Neusner says this. He goes back to the New Testament. He says, Jesus believed in the Torah of Moses, and that belief required faithful Jews to enter a dissent at the teachings of Jesus on the grounds that those teachings at important points contradict the Torah. And therefore, because that specific teaching was so broadly out of phase with the Torah and covenant of Sinai, I could not then follow him and do not now either. That is not because I am stubborn or unbelieving. It is because I believe God has given a different Torah from the one that Jesus teaches. And that Torah, the one Moses got at Sinai, stands in judgment of the Torah of Jesus, as it dictates true and false for all other Torahs that people want to teach in God's name. William Lane Craig, commenting on these words, says, given the supremely authoritative status of the divinely revealed Torah, Jesus' teaching can only appear presumptuous and even blasphemous. And in fact, as Robert Hutchinson put it, Neusner wants to ask Jesus, who do you think you are, God? Neusner himself recognizes that no one can encounter Matthew's Jesus without concurring that before us in the evangelist's mind is God incarnate. But if Jesus' opposition of his personal teaching to the Torah is an authentic facet of the historical Jesus, as even the skeptical scholars of the Jesus Seminar concede, then it seems that Jesus did arrogate to himself the authority of God. Raymond Brown said this. Raymond Brown, who's Raymond Brown? Probably the greatest New Testament scholar of the latter part of the 20th century. He said, Jesus knew his own identity, which involved a unique relationship to God that we call the divinity of the Son. Christians of a later period were able to formulate Jesus' identity as true God and true man, a formulation better than any other that had been attempted, but certainly not exhaustive of the mystery. Despite the Gnostics and Docetists, there is little need to prove that Jesus was human. The idea that he was divine I find on most gospel pages. An attempt to lessen the self-evaluation of Jesus to something like, he thought only that he was a prophet, would in my judgment involve proving that the Gospels misunderstood Jesus. No Old Testament prophet acted in such independence of the Mosaic law, and it is remarkable that no one ever finds in reference to Jesus a prophetic formula such as, the Word of God came to Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I put in here a reference, Luke 3:2. In Luke 3:2, Luke says the Word of God came to John the Baptist. So the Gospels were not averse to taking that Old Testament formula and applying it to their own prophets. And so Jesus was merely a prophet. You would expect the gospel writers to say the word of the Lord came to Jesus. The presupposition seems to be that the word did not have to come to him, but that he already had it, to which John gives an even further formulation. He was the word. Horst Georg Pohlmann, sorry for the typo, says this. He says, this unheard of claim to authority, as it comes to expression in the antithesis of the Sermon on the Mount, for example, is implicit Christology, since it presupposes a unity of Jesus with God that is deeper than that of all men, namely a unity of essence. This claim to authority is explicable only from the side of his deity. This authority only God himself can claim. With regard to Jesus, there are only two possible modes of behavior, either to believe that in him God encounters us, or to nail him to the cross as a blasphemer. Tertium non datur. There is no third way. So these scholars do acknowledge there is multiple evidence that Jesus really did claim to be divine. Now, I recognize that the majority of scholars don't believe this. But notice, I'm now looking at this from the standpoint of a resurrected Jesus. And I'm now going to go back and look at the evidence. And I think that the evidence that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah and the unique Son of God can pass these critical criteria that many scholars offer to judge these other facts about Jesus. Is he a liar? Well, that would contradict fact number 3, that Jesus was a good moral teacher. The other question is, would Jesus die for what he knew was a lie? He died claiming that he is the unique Son of God. In fact, if you remember, that's why he was condemned in court. Would he die for that? Remember, liars make poor martyrs, and that would be true of Jesus as anybody else. So if he was lying, it's very unlikely that he would go to his death with that claim. Now the question is he a lunatic? Well, that would contradict fact number 3 as well. And C.S. Lewis says this, also the historical difficulty of giving for the life sayings and influences of Jesus, any explanation not harder than the Christian explanation is very great. The discrepancy between the death and sanity, and let me add shrewdness of his moral teaching, and the rampant megalomania which must lie behind his theological teaching unless he is indeed God, has never been satisfactorily got over. So, Establishing fact number 3, hopefully you'll see why that was so important. Showing that he's a good moral teacher, that we actually benefit from that once we start vetting out who is this man Jesus. He can't be merely a good moral teacher, because if he's claiming to be divine, then he is not just a good moral teacher. He's a loony or a liar. But if he is, in fact, a good moral teacher, you have to say that he is divine. Well, in what sense is he divine? Maybe he was just a pantheistic Eastern guru saying, tap into the divinity within. But that hypothesis does not take into account the historical context of his teaching. He is a Jew. He's a Jewish monotheist. So if Jesus were walking around India saying these things, maybe he's just a lama. But he's walking around Israel. He's walking around Judea. He's saying to Jews, I am God. And he's saying, I believe in the God of Israel. So on the one hand, he's speaking in the name of the God of Israel. And he's also saying at the very same time, in some sense, I am that God of Israel. Lord. Jesus must have been Lord, or as Christians say, God incarnate. And we have 2 positive evidences for this. Jesus performed miracles and Jesus raised from the dead. And so this is my argument for mere Christianity. God exists. Well, why do I say that? I have the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument. Miracles are automatically possible given God's existence. If God performs miracles in a person's life, then he approves of that person's teachings, life, and claims. I should have said that person's life, teachings, and claims. But God approves of the claims of Jesus. And how do I know that? Because Jesus performed miracles and he rose from the dead. Jesus claimed to be God incarnate. Therefore, Jesus is God incarnate. And that is the end of our lesson.